The following presentation is brought to you by Saraí, López, Sorto, and Francisco Ernesto Soto Monteagudo. We are going to talk about theories of second language acquisition. We will begin by giving concise meaning of the terms theory as well as second language acquisition, or in short, SLA. Next, we present the constituents of a theory of SLA before we actually explain its current theories and models. At the end, we give convenient pieces of advice to go from theory to practice.
What is a theory? It's an extended definition, a set of rules, principles, and knowledge about a topic, and an explanation of a set of observable phenomena. But our interest is in the theory of second language acquisition. First, what is a second language acquisition? It's a set of general human learning that involves cognitive variations and is related to personality type. Is interwoven with the learning of speech and communicative function of the language, and it is often characterized by stages of learning, development of trial and error processes. These elements or categories are a base to build a theory of second language acquisition. And a second language acquisition theory is an interrelated set of hypotheses and or claims about how people become proficient in a second language. In order to build a theory of SLA, it's important to take into account some domains and generalizations that describe the skeletal structure of a theory. Here we have a taxonomy proposed by Iorio in 1976. This shows different domains that must be included in a theory of SLA. A second language acquisition theory has to include a general understanding of what is language and what is learning. For children, the knowledge of the learning of the first language provides essential information for the SLA comprehension. However, it is necessary to consider that there are differences between the learning of adult and child, and also differences between first and second language. The learning of a second language is part of the general principle of the human learning and intelligence, and is adhered to them. The personality affects the quantity and quality of the learning of second language, because the way in which people view themselves and reveal in the communication of the second language acquisition. In the learning of a second language, the second culture is often intricately woven. The communicative competence is the last goal of learners, and it is the language socialization. They deal with function, discourse, style, and nonverbal aspects of human interaction. The contrast between the native and target language form a difficulty in learning a second language, but the creative process of forming an interlanguage system implies that the learner uses many facilitative sources and resources. The errors are inevitable aspects in the process, but the learners and teachers can gain more information about them. As we saw at the beginning, a second language acquisition theory is a set of interrelated hypotheses and claims. Here is a summary with some claims made by Lightbound in 1985 in his second language acquisition research. The claims are: it is possible for both adolescent and adult to acquire a second language. The learner creates a systematic language that many times is characterized for having the same systematic error as children learn the first language. Practice helps but doesn't make perfect. Knowing grammar rules of the language doesn't mean that we can use in a communicative interaction. Isolated correction of the language are not effective to change the language behavior. For the most adult learners, the learning is fossilized before they achieve the level of native speaker in the target language. A learner cannot reach the native speaker level studying 1 hour a day. And the last, learning a second language is an enormous task because the language is really complex. How do we know we have the appropriate components of a theory? Here we have a synthesis of the comments of Larsen Freeman that can help us to design a theory of second language acquisition. First, we have to be aware of false dichotomies. We have to look for complementarity, inclusiveness, and interface. It is necessary to be aware about the lineal and causal approaches because the second language acquisition is so complex with many interacting factors that state that there is a single cause for second language acquisition effect is go too far. Be aware about overgeneralization. Pay attention for details. Many factors to learn a second language can result in importance. And be aware about the reductionist thinking. Here we have another suggestions about the theory building. These are made by Michael Longs, and in order to create an integral theory of the second language acquisition, he said that we have to take into account universals for environmental factors, for variability in age, acquisition rate, and proficiency level, and also explain both cognitive and affective factors. Account for form-focused learning, and also account for other variables besides exposure and input, and account for cognitive innate factors which explain their language systemicity, and also recognize that acquisition is not a steady accumulation of generalizations. The process of theory building may be illustrated in the form of several models of second language acquisition that have appeared in recent history. We are going to present some of these models. The first is the crashing input hypothesis, which is one of the most controversial theoretical perspectives in second language acquisition. And here we can identify a set of 5 interrelated hypotheses. The first is the acquisition learning hypothesis, where Krashen's claim that adult second language learners have 2 means for internalizing the target language. The first is acquisition, a subconscious and intuitive process of constructing the system of a language. The second mean is a conscious learning process, in which learners attempt to form, figure out rules, and are generally aware of their own process. About fluency, Krashen said that in second language performance is due to what we have acquired, not what we have learned. So, adults should therefore do as much acquiring as possible in order to achieve communicative fluency. The second hypothesis, hypothesis monitor. The monitor is involved in learning, not in acquisition. It is a device for watchdogging one's output, for editing and making alteration or correction as they are consciously perceived. The natural order hypothesis. Here, Krashen has claimed that we acquire language in a predictable or natural order. In 4 hypotheses, input hypothesis. According to Krashen, the comprehensible input is the only true cause of second language acquisition. The input hypothesis claims that an important condition for language acquisition occurs if the learner understands via being or reading the input language that contains a structure a bit beyond his or her current level of competence. Here, Krashen's recommend that speaking not be taught directly or very early in the language classroom. Speech will emerge once the learner has built up enough comprehensible input. And the last, effective filter hypothesis. Here, Krashen has further claimed that the best acquisition will occur in environments where anxiety is low and defensiveness absent, or in Krashen's terms, in contexts where the effective filter is taught.
Cognitive models. Although it is easy to conceptualize SLA in terms of conscious and subconscious processes, there are two problems. The first one is that consciousness is a tricky term, and two, child language acquisition is not necessarily better. In this part, two cognitive models will be addressed. The first one is McLaughlin's attention processing model, and the second one is implicit and explicit model. Now let us analyze McLaughlin's attention processing model. In this model, we rule out the conscious continuum in constructing a viable theory of SLA, and we do not hold child first language acquisition up as the ideal model of language acquisition. This model juxtaposes processing mechanism, controlled and automatic, and categories of attention to form four cells that we discuss in a table in the next slide. But now let us focus on these first two terms, controlled and automatic, regarding the processing mechanism. Well, controlled processes are capacity limited and temporary, while automatic processes are relatively permanent. We can think of controlled processing as typical of anyone learning a brand new skill, in which only very few elements of the skill can be retained. The rest is far too complex for one's capacity-limited ability. Now, automatic processes, on the other hand, refers to processing in a much accomplished skill where you can process more data in less time. This happens thanks to more automatic strategies used to process data and automatic responses to it. Now, let us discuss the other two terms that have to do with attention. They are focal and peripheral, and I'm going to explain them by giving you an example. Imagine that you are driving a car. Your focal attention may center on cars directly in front of you as you move forward, but your peripheral attention to cars beside you and behind you, to potential hazards, and of course to the other thoughts running through your mind. This is all very much within your conscious awareness. But what does this have to do with learning a foreign language? And more specifically, how does McLaughlin's model apply to practical aspects of learning a second language? After having thoroughly defined these four terms, we are now ready to analyze this table, which juxtaposes the attention to formal properties of language and the information processing. In the attention, we have the focal and peripheral. And remember, focal attention differentiates from peripheral in that this first is the intentional attention, and control and automatic differentiate in that control is a new skill, capacity limited, while automatic refers to a well-trained practice skill, capacity, which is relatively unlimited. In the first cell, which combines focal attention with controlled information processing, we have a performance based on formal rule learning. And as an example, we have the grammatical explanation of a specific point, word definition, copy a written model, the first stages of memorizing a dialogue, prefabricated patterns, and various discrete point exercises. Now, in the second one, second combination, that is the focal attention with the automatic information processing. We have a performance in a test situation. That's a good example because it can be the keeping an eye out for something, or an advanced L2 learner when he or she focuses on modals, clause formation, etc. And also we have the monitoring oneself while talking and writing, scanning a test, or editing or and peer editing. Now in the peripheral attention, we have the peripheral and controlled information processing, the performance based on implicit learning or analog learning. We have as examples simple greetings, the later stages of memorizing a dialogue, a natural approach, or when the new L2 learner successfully completes a brief conversation. And now the final, that is the ideal performance, a performance in communicative situations. We have open-ended group work as an example, as well as other rapid reading skimming, free writes, or normal conversational exchanges of some length. Another set of controls for conceptualizing the varied processes of second language learning is found in models that make a distinction between explicit and implicit linguistic knowledge. In the implicit category, let me see, in the explicit category are the facts that a person knows about the language, and this happens when you have studied in a formal way. Whereas implicit knowledge is information that is automatically and spontaneously used in language tasks. That happens with our first language. We may not know how our first language works, but we have an implicit knowledge of it that allows us to speak in a fluent way, with fluency. Children implicitly learn phonological, syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic rules for language, but do not have access to an explanation. They don't have any clue explicitly to those rules. Implicit process enable a learning to perform language, but not necessarily to cite rules governing the performance. Another researcher equated implicit and explicit with the synonym terms unanalyzed and analyzed knowledge. Unanalyzed knowledge is the general form in which we know most things without being aware of the structure of that knowledge. On the other hand, learners are overtly aware of the structure of analyzed knowledge, but not of the unanalyzed. This same model feature a distinction between automatic and non-automatic processing based on McLaughlin's conception on automaticity. Automaticity refers to the learner's relative access to the knowledge. Knowledge that can be retrieved easily and quickly is automatic. Knowledge that makes time and effort to retrieve is non-automatic. The concepts of automaticity, non-automaticity, and of explicit, implicit knowledge have drawn the attention of numerous researchers over the past decade or so. Now we have a social constructivist model, Long's interaction hypothesis. The social constructivist perspectives that are associated with more current approaches to both first and second language acquisition emphasize the dynamic nature of the interplay between learners and their peers, and their teachers, and others with whom they interact. In Long's view, comprehensible input is a result of modified interaction. But what does he mean by this? It is, for example, when native speakers often slow down speech to second language learners, speaking more deliberately in order for them to understand. In Long's view, conversations and other interactive communications are the basis for the development of the linguistic rules. He sees interaction and input as two major players in the process of acquisition. Here, principles of awareness, autonomy, and authenticity lead the learning into the zone of proximal development, where learners construct the new language through socially mediated interaction. This is constructivist, and we can cite the first proponent of this SPD, or zone of proximal development, Vygotsky. In Vygotsky's words, The zone of proximal development is the distance between the actual development level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance, or in collaboration with more capable peers. So there are a few essential factors that are critical to the success of this learning process. The first one is the presence of someone with the knowledge and skills to guide the learner, and in this case, most of the times, it is the teachers who does this role, who plays this role. The second factor is the social interactions that allow the learner to observe and practice their skills. And the third factor is the scaffolding or supportive activities provided by the mentor or teacher that help guide the learning through the zone of proximal development. The final part of this video presentation will be some pieces of advice as to how to move from theory to practice. The field of second language learning and teaching has for many decades now been plagued by debates about the relationship between theory and practice. This historical milepost notwithstanding, the custom of leaving theory to researchers and practice to teachers has become dysfunctional. Why? Because we are all practitioners, we are all theorists. We are all charged with developing a broadly based conceptualization of the process of language learning and teaching. We are all responsible for understanding as much as we can how to create context for optimal acquisition among learners. Let's say, if you as teacher or as a student have thoughts about the relevance of age factors, cognitive style variations, intercultural communication, and strategic competence to a set of learners and tasks, then you are constructing theory. This means that you, perhaps as a novice in this field, can indeed formulate an integrating understanding of SLA. Now, how do you join this community of theorists? Here are some suggestions. The first one is to play both the believing and the doubting game. We have presented you several models and theories of second language acquisition, and now you have to take them with a grain of salt. You must look for the flaws in them as well as the good points in order to create a rationale for a second language acquisition. The second suggestion would be to appreciate both the art and science of SLA. You know that languages are highly abstract. And so there are two approaches as to how to draw conclusions. One tradition is a nomothetic tradition of empiricism, scientific methodology, and prediction. This is the behavioristic school of thought. On the other hand, we have a hermeneutic tradition, which provides us with a means for interpretation and understanding in which we do not look for absolute laws. The artful side of theory building will surely involve us in the creative use of metaphor, as we seek to describe that which cannot always be empirically defined. And the last suggestion will be to trust, to some extent, your intuition. Why? Well, because intuition is less rigorous with respect to proof, more visual or iconic, more oriented to the whole problem than to particular parts, less verbalized with respect to justification, and based on a confidence in one's ability to operate with insufficient data. That's the end of this video presentation. Thank you for the attention.